Hi, welcome to SparkPost Send It School. Today we're going to be talking about email authentication. So here we are, today's co-pilots. I'll let Alwyn introduce himself.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Alwyn de Bruin. I'm with dmarcian, responsible for deploying DMARC with customers, and I do have authentication background, so it's natural to be here.
Awesome, really excited to have you here. My name's George Slosnagel. I'm the founder and chief evangelist at SparkPost. And so today, Alwyn and I are going to be running you through authentication, particularly around SPF, DKIM, DMARC, and BIMI. So a brief bit on what we're gonna cover today. So first, we're going to talk about what authentication is and why it's important to you. A little bit of that is a history lesson and a discussion around how email and mailboxes have changed over time. We're going to talk a little bit about some current problems, particularly that relate to authentication as well, and then dive in and really talk in more detail about these four principal means of authentication today. So SPF, DKIM, DMARC, and BIMI, and then touch a little bit on how you can work on a plan for deploying these things with your own IT team. Great. So what is authentication and why is it important? So for the recipient of an email, authentication is important because there's this really hard question about, is this email real or is it just a really good fake? I think we've all received spam or phishing mails that look like they may be the real thing. Maybe we've been fooled by them. Maybe we've almost been fooled by them. Huge problem within the industry today, and just a general continuance of the trend of abuse within email. So for recipients, this is really critical in protecting themselves. An important note about this is that that authentication in its raw form is not really designed for end users to process themselves. It's really for machines, so the machines can help protect users from themselves. I know many of these people on this call may be sophisticated, may consider yourself immune to phishing. I will say there's some really sophisticated fishes out there. I've certainly come close to being caught in a number of them, but also we're not the principal audience for these technologies. Like, technologists in general, I think, tend to be more savvy. I think about this as from the perspective of my mother or my kids, both of whom are, I think, maybe less discriminating consumers of email, and so just a lot of exposure surface there. Authentication is important for the sender, really for the same reasons. So how do I protect my customers and, by extension, my own reputation? So part of this is a purely altruistic component where you're looking at none of us want our users to be phished or abused or suffer loss because they confused an attack email with something that came from us. But it also impacts our reputation. Even if you have no direct control over it, if your customers receive a message that looks like it's from you, they think it's from you, and they get exploited because of it, it's not a good look for anyone involved. And so as senders, we have real strong motivations, protective motivations, both for our recipients and for ourselves in implementing authentication. So let's talk a little bit about changing mailbox rules and the evolution of reputation. So we have to remember here that email goes back a very long time, and in a way, it's an open protocol that allows everyone to participate. And with every open protocol, some folks at some point start exploring the possibilities towards taking advantage of it. And we saw that with email. For people that have been involved in the internet for a long time, we know that since the mid-90s, email has been a rampantly abused means of communication that's really suffered from a tragedy of the commons due to being so open. So as that abuse, spam, et cetera, grew, service providers wanted a way to build reputation systems that allowed them to measure how much they trust a given sender versus having to holistically evaluate every single piece of mail. So part of that is just a real practical one. It is very difficult to evaluate the spamminess or legitimacy of mail based off of content. You know, as somebody who helps operate a large sending service, I can tell you with complete certainty that you know, there's a lot of mail that is wanted by the recipients who actively engage with it in many ways that I would look at and never personally want, right? I think that that's something that's very uncommon. Email is about consent and about pleasing your recipient and giving them something that they desire, and that can really differ. So it's very hard to evaluate that for every single end recipient, and also very hard to scale. So as those problems grew, mailbox providers sought to find higher level reputational entities to help judge whether or not mail was, you know, at a broad scale, good or bad. So how do we do that? So we're back one slide. Here we go. So really there are really like three fundamental identities that come in sending email. The first is the IP address that mail originates from, the IP address of your mail server. Or if you're, you know, running multiple mail streams, maybe it's associated with a specific mail stream. Now, the benefits of IP-based reputation are that IPs are not easily forgeable. They're easy to be a persistent identifier. So especially because they have reputation associated with them, you know, it behooves senders to stick with an IP. Some of the limitations are, A, it's not intrinsically tied to an entity, or it's very difficult to tie that back to a specific entity. You know, maybe you use a service provider, maybe those IPs belong to that service provider, maybe that service provider leases IPs from a larger organization and it's difficult to determine exactly which are theirs. Those are real problems. It's also not something that's visible in any way, shape, or form to the end user unless you do deep header inspection. So the next type of identity is identity of the sending infrastructure that you're using. So what are the host names that email originates from? You know, both the host name that the mail server identifies it by and the return path on the email. So like the routing information on the email, which also has a domain associated with it. Now, some benefits of these: one, they're registered to an entity, right? So these are domain names, they belong to somebody. You can look up registrar information on them. It's a very sticky, persistent entity. Unfortunately, they're easily forgeable. So, you know, absent authentication, I can fire up an SMTP session and send mail purporting to be from anyone in the world. And you know, there's nothing intrinsic in the protocol that stops that. They're also not clearly visible to the end recipient. So the routing information that goes along with an email, while it ends up getting encoded in the headers of the email, are not the things that are typically displayed back out to the end user. So it's not the from address that is seen in the like in your mail client. And so the third important sender identity is the from address and from domain that you're sending from. So again, registered to an entity, also easily forgeable for exactly the same reason. I can put anything I want into an email, but is clearly associated with the end recipient, and it's the thing that you see as the from address when you're scrolling through your mailbox. So it's really important to secure all of these identities. And when we look at the progression of authentication technologies, it's really about mailbox providers seeking to have mechanisms that allow them to say, this domain belongs to this person, and it's a sticky identity that I can say with authority actually belongs to them, right? The person sending from this domain, whether it's the infrastructure from the host or from within the email itself, it belongs to this organization, and I know that with good certainty, and then I can build reputation around it, right? So then I can associate, oh, so sparkpost.com is a good sender. People engage with their mail. They want their mail. This thing that comes from SparkPost, and I'm certain it does because I have some authenticating technology, must be a reasonably good piece of email. It allows them to prejudge good content, and in absence of that, sort of prejudge what might be sketchy or bad content. So as we go through history, there are a number of different ways to authenticate those standards, and there were multiple standards that arose out of that. So here we can kind of see a history timeline of, someday I'll learn how to use GoToWebinar well, a history timeline of different authentication technologies. So in the beginning, there were a number of disassociated predecessors to SPF. Then in 2003, 2004, SPF, Sender Policy Framework, was defined as an experimental standard, started getting rolled out. We'll talk about this in more depth in a minute, but SPF seeks to authenticate that sending infrastructure, right? Who do the servers belong to, and can I be certain of it? Then following that, there was a desire to secure the from address in the email, right? So how do I secure the content and know that the content is from the from domain that it says it's from? And that started out with a technology called domain keys, which ended up getting wrapped into the current standard, which is DKIM. Then after that, there was a need to, so one of the issues with both SPF and DKIM was a lack of both reporting and policy enforcement within the standards themselves. So how do I know whether or not a domain is supposed to sign their mails? Are there people that are sending mails that are not passing my policy? And so DMARC seeks to provide an answer to that by building a policy framework on top of both SPF and DKIM. And then some subsequent standards to help alleviate issues with DMARC. Again, because email is this old standard with a really strong history of interoperability, there are often edge cases on these technologies that make them difficult to implement. So both for SPF and DKIM, a common issue is around forwarding of messages and how authentication gets preserved through that. And so there you see things like ARC. So this is really talking about transport layer authentication of identities. There's a whole separate history of authentication and protection standards around transport security that we're not going to touch on today. So things like DANE and TLS and MTA-STS that are more around like, how do I encrypt the communication between two servers? And unfortunately, we barely have time to really touch on these issues, let alone to talk about encryption. Great. So some quick deployment stats before I pass over to Alwyn. So across 1.5 million commercial senders that we track, you see really high deployment of both SPF and DKIM. It's interesting to note, and we'll come back to this, that there's also a very high error rate for SPF in terms of bogus policies. DMARC adoption is good, but still lagging SPF and DKIM. It's a much newer standard, and then below that you have BIMI, which we'll talk about at the end, which is really a carrot to marketers for helping incentivize adoption of DMARC. and currently the BIMI adoption stats are so low that they're not worth even reporting here. So with that, I want to pass over to Alwyn to talk about current challenges.
Yeah, I'm based on the story George told us before. I'm going to sort of continue on that part. I think in general the thing is we see an uptick in fraud, so eventually the challenges go on. I'm trying to set the stage a little bit more towards why authentication is really important. Normally tend to tell my story based on images. So this image actually dates back to 2005. So exposing the fact that phishing or at least authentication of email is important, because a lot of end users actually do not understand if an email is really not real or not. So convincing and luring the users to actually, well, click on links and open up email messages. I think in general, what we see with the general adoption of email authentication standards is that a lot of domain owners actually are not yet practicing the email authentication in a proper way. And the interesting thing is that mostly marketeers or people trying to deliver email, they use deliverability techniques like SPF and DKIM to actually get the messages delivered. But everyone trying to abuse the ecosystem is doing that already. So what we see with every step we take, the criminals are sort of running one step ahead, and well, they have normally financial benefits, so they really are following the standards and improving their own emails, email delivery. Again, throwing at you some random stats. So what we've seen from a security perspective is that if an organization is being targeted, I think in 91% of all the cases, cyber attack just starts with email, because email is so open. And the interesting thing is that due to the bad email deliverability best practices, we see that often there's bad authenticated email, and then the phishing email actually looks better. So it's it's just important to actually practice that. Again, throwing at you some other stats. So Gmail reported 100 million phishing email per day. I think that stat dates back to last year. 68% of those emails are new every day. So there's a lot of new email actually ending up on the internet, which is being classified as phishing, which is just really interesting to see happening. And of course, if we look at the current things happening in the world, people are trying to play on news and media and other people looking for information on the internet. So Google reported, I think back in April, 240 million phishing emails related to COVID-19. So it's really important to understand that they're looking at what is happening in the world. Just a summary, like why could someone actually, well, try to phish or try to send bad email? Of course, we know fraud, we know identity theft, espionage, sabotage, ransomware, but the outcome for an organization will always be the same. So if an organization's domain is being abused, it results into blacklisting, domain reputation damage, spam complaints, poor inbox placement. So if you're not protecting yourself against this behavior happening on the internet, well, eventually you're going to feel the pain anyway. And I think this has been practiced all over again and all over again. So within the world of cybersecurity, it's really, well, previously it would be like, oh, I'm not going to be the target of, but nowadays it's not really a matter of, it's just a matter of when. And that's everyone is eventually going to suffer from it. If you're just a private individual with a domain, or a large organization, or a large enterprise, or a multinational, you're actually going to feel the pain of domain abuse. And I think that's also in a way related to what we experience in the world currently. So due to the bad practices in general regarding email deliverability standards, we happen to see a sort of shadow IT problem. So in a way, the organization, due to its open structure of email and no domain protection, everyone is able to send on behalf of a domain. and even within organizations, people can actually, well, do that. So we're trying to put a lot of time and effort from a system administrator perspective into defining on how emails should be sent. And we have a general impression that we know as an organization who is sending on behalf of our domain. So we have corporate email or a marketing solution sending out email for promotions or transactional email. But what happens in reality, if there's no protection in place, everyone can actually send on behalf of your domain. So we happen to see help desk software, billing platforms, etc., etc. Everyone is actually experiencing the same thing. And not sure who's all on the call, but I think anyone in a way can relate to the fact that they decided to bypass IT because they asked these different questions about authenticating their email, implementing authentication techniques, which can be challenging or take a lot of time because you just want to start sending email. And I think everyone has their own role in the email ecosystem and how shadow IT actually affects their role. So marketing, you're trying to drive your customer communications. You want to enforce a brand experience. From operations perspective, you want to keep your applications running as usual. Again, security is trying to take control of everything happening on the domain or happening with the organization. Finance is trying to, well, solve that they're not going to pay the worst things and make sure that they keep everything in place. And eventually the leadership is trying to juggle everything all along together, keeping the organization all moving in place and protecting it in a proper way. So to actually be able to take care of shadow IT within your organization, and that's the same for protecting your brand or your domain against abuse. There's a sort of three-step approach. So I personally tend to advise look at a DMARC initiative, because the most important thing is that you, as an organization, you want to get insight in who is sending on behalf of your domain. And DMARC as a technology actually offers that solution to you. So you're able to get an insight on who is sending email on behalf of your domain. Why are multiple email solutions being used trying to achieve the same thing? So you could actually consolidate all those services into one solution and, well, enforce everything from one particular perspective and, well, reduce costs, risks, don't share customer data all over the place. And again, eventually keeping track with everything is happening in the organization. So continue monitoring your domain usage and use real-time alerting and domain reputation alerting and engagement trends, etc., to keep track of how your email's actually behaving. And I'm going to pass it back to George because he's able to build the technical, I think, Lego blocks regarding email authentication.
That sounds great. So in this next section, we're going to talk about some specifics about how SPF and DKIM work, and then pass off to Alwyn to talk about similar for DMARC. So an important first step to really understanding how these work is to understand a little bit about how email itself works. Let's see if my advancing works. 1 second. Okay. So email takes a lot of its structure from postal mail. There's an envelope which contains all of the routing information for the email. Where's it coming from? Where's it going to? And then inside of that, you actually have the body of the email, which you can think of as like the letter. The letter also has, it's who it's from and who it's to. Those don't need to be the same, right? Just like if you're sending a postal letter, if you send a postal letter to me, like if you wanted to send a postal letter to my son, whose address you don't know, you could send a letter to me at work, and I might get it and open it up, and I'd see like, oh, it's actually for Christopher on the inside, and I would give it to him. Similar sort of breakout between envelope and content happens in email as well. So if we look at the envelope, here we're talking about the information that is exchanged during the actual SMTP dialogue for routing mail between servers. So this is stuff that you, as an end recipient of the mail, you typically don't see. A lot of it ends up getting encoded in the headers of the mail, but that's not really the source of record. The source of record for it is here inside the SMTP transaction itself. So when I send a mail, I'm going to connect to the next hop server, so probably the MX for the destination of the email, and I'm going to connect from a certain IP address. So that's effectively part of the envelope, even if it's not actually part of the dialogue. I'm going to send identifying server information that says, "Hi, this is my server name," and then I'm going to specify who it's going to, and then who it's coming from, and then who it's going to. Now, importantly and commonly, that mail from in the SMTP envelope is not the same as the from address in the actual mail itself. Now, if you're sending person-to-person mail, if I'm sending a message to Alwyn through Gmail, those two will be the same. But typically for commercial mail, the from address inside the message might be app@sparkpost.com, but the mail from is something that's intended to handle any sort of error reporting on the return, and is probably a different like unassociated email box. So it may be something like the super traditional like no reply at sparkpost.com, which hopefully we and you don't use, but it may be some other thing that's tagged for that, particularly if you're using a service provider to send your mail. Almost always that mail from ends up being something different. It's either something that is specific to them if you're not using a like a custom mail from domain. So it might be a domain that's owned and operated by that service provider. Or if it is one that's owned by you, it's still probably not the same because you want it to route back to that service provider so that they can handle any sort of bounces or things like that correctly. Then inside of that, we have the data section, which is where the email goes. And so that email will have, that has its own header information, much like, if you open the letter, the letter inside of an envelope, it may have some information as well, like it's like a memo, so there's like a subject and a from address and other header information as well. So that's where you find things like an automated list unsubscribe header would be there. The DKIM signature, which if you're signing with DKIM, that gets encoded as a header in the mail, and then additionally the body content of the mail itself. So like I mentioned, a lot of that envelope information, once that message is received by the receiving party, their MTAs will end up encoding that information in various parts of the headers. Again, it's not really the authoritative source of that information, but it's there and it's useful for debugging, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see this information at all, because it's not actually part of the message that you sent. It's stuff that the receiver encodes into it. So the receiver of a message will add a header to a mail called return path, and that return path contains the mail from of the mail that you sent. That's like the address that I, the sender, said was the routing address for automated responses, bounces, things like that, where it actually came from. The server name that we EHLO as is recorded as well in the received header, as well as the IP address. And then many providers will add a authentication results header where you'll actually see, and they'll encode, the results of their authentication processing. So who received it? Do they think it passed DKIM? Do they think it passed SPF? Do they think it passed DMARC? And then analysis in there inside of each of those stanzas regarding, like what parts might have failed, or what, policy information if it succeeded. So when you get your mail in Gmail, this is what it ends up looking like, and that's an effective way of debugging, problems that you might have. One of the easiest ways, outside of using a DKIM validator or an SPF validator or a DMARC validator, if you're looking to understand what's going on with your authentication, is to send yourself an email at Google or G Suite or Yahoo address, and then look at the show original version of the email, and then you can dissect the authentication results header if you're trying to do technical debugging. Great. So SPF. SPF is a technology that is designed to authenticate this envelope information of the mail. So it doesn't really concern itself with the body at all. It doesn't have any elements for authenticating that. It allows you to authenticate the server and say, hey, in this example, my server, the name of the host as identified when your server addresses itself to a remote server. Is this use of my server a legitimate use? And similarly, in the mail from, is this mail from allowed to be used in this context? And the way that works is that SPF, in its simplest form, SPF allows you to state the IPs and net blocks that your mail may come from. So, like the most simple SPF policy would be like, if like that you have one email server and what its IP address is, you could create an SPF record that just says this domain sends mail from this IP address, and that will secure the EHLO and the mail from domain. Typically, though, sending environments are a little bit more complex than that, and so SPF has additional rules that allow you to point to other DNS rules, including things like check to see whether or not the MX record for the sending domain contains this IP address that I'm connecting as one of its elements. And importantly, particularly if you're using a service provider as part of your mail stream, to include other SPF records recursively. So if you send through SparkPost, or you send through SendGrid, or you send through someone like that, then when you go to configure SPF, the easiest way to do that is that provider will provide you a SPF record to include, and then your SPF, your own SPF record, in addition to any other things you may want to include there, will say like include spf.sparkpost.com. And that says, hey, Mr. Receiver, when you process this message, go dynamically query this outside SPF record and include it in the processing. So all of those describe the ways that you're able to effectively whitelist or allow list IPs for that domain. And then there's like an or else part, right? What is the default behavior if the IP address that I'm connecting from doesn't positively match one of those rules? And so SPF provides 4 mechanisms for that. The first is plus all, which is permissive, default to accept everything, which is, you don't really need any other rule, because then it's like, if I match, then good, and otherwise also good. Not commonly used. It's not a very useful record. There's neutral, which excuse me, states no statement. Like, it literally is saying, I don't have an opinion at all as to whether or not this IP address is allowed to represent my domain. There's tilde all, which is a soft fail, which is a weak assertion of non-authorization, which in many ways was designed as a transition mechanism for people transitioning onto SPF. although many senders include that as their long-term default record. Mail that soft fails basically typically gets handled as it's a fail on SPF, but it instructs the service provider to consider other mechanisms. So it's saying, I don't think that this is my IP address, but please look at other things that may assert ownership. And a great example there is DKIM, right? So, hey, it's okay that I soft fail because my DKIM signature will pass. And then the strictest is -all, which is a hard fail, which is a strong assertion of non-authorization, which says you should not accept messages from this IP address with with the indicated EHLO or mail from domain, because I'm positively asserting that this is definitely not me. So there's some best practices for SPF. Again, this probably like a good preamble. What would have been a good preamble for this whole talk is that really this topic of email authentication is probably a solid 8 hours of content that no one wants to sit there at a given moment. Definitely way too long for a webinar. I'll have some recommendations on places where you can go for additional information. This is by no means intended to be authoritative, sort of across the talk. But let's talk about some common SPF best practices. The first is to be as strict as you can with your policy. So we recommend, and what is typically recommended by experts, is to either go with tilde-all or -all. So either go with a soft fail or a hard fail. Tilde-all is a safe way to assert that you do not think something belongs to you, and to still have it likely delivered, assuming that other things pass. Particularly when combined with a reporting DMARC record, you have really good telemetry on why things are failing, and then you can make a decision as to whether or not your SPF rule needs to be augmented, or if really it's in fact not good. So SPF has a limit on 10 includes for these recursive includes that I talked about, and that's applied to both the include record, which fetches an additional policy, as well as a redirect, which says ignore this policy, check this other one. This is a limit that catches a lot of people. So as a service provider, one of the best practices that we adopt, and we highly encourage other service providers to adopt, is to not use include whenever possible for our own records, because our records are designed to be included. So we want to minimize the impact that we contribute to that. But in general, it's something that you need to be very careful about, which leads to point 3, which is you should regularly check your SPF record for errors. We saw in the stats before that a significant number of SPF records have errors in them. Because of this include issue, this can occur even if you don't change anything. You can have a perfectly working SPF record today that includes maybe a couple other providers' records because because of that shadow IT problem, you use 3 or 4 different service providers. You include all of their different records. A change in one of their records that results in a recursive include on their side can pop you over that 10 limit and cause a problem. So it's really important that you monitor this proactively, not only when you change it, but it's just an ongoing course of action. A great thing to remember is if you use a service provider and you don't use your own return path domain. So like for instance, if you send with SparkPost, then by default, we will, the mail from will be something that routes from our domain to the domain that we own. You don't need to worry about SPF. SPF doesn't affect you. It only affects you if you either use a service provider and for DMARC and SPF alignment reasons, which Alwyn will talk about in a minute, you want those to be under the same domain, or for visibility reasons, you want them to be under the same domain. Or if you operate your own mail, those are the times when you need to have an SPF record, because it authenticates the infrastructure itself. And then mentioned before, but worth repeating, SPF does not secure the from appearing in the email client. Email's confusing that way. There are two froms. There's the mail from, which also is referred to as the return path, and then there's the from line in the email. Sometimes the same, often not. Definitely don't need to be the same. SPF does not secure the from. So if you need help building an SPF record, we have a free free SPF builder on our tools site. So that'll help you create the rule, and then it's a DNS record. So to set the record, you'll need to get assistance from someone who manages DNS for your domain. Great. Let's move on to DKIM. So whereas SPF secured the envelope, DKIM is gonna secure the message itself and the associated headers. So what DKIM basically does is DKIM is a way of cryptographically signing the message to assert that it came from a given entity, right? So oftentimes that's the from address, right? So you want the from domain, and the from of the actual message itself is signing the message, or a hash of the message, using using public key cryptography, and then publishing a DNS record that allows the recipient of the mail to perform the same operation and to match the hashes, right? So the sender effectively creates a hash, signs it. The recipient can decrypt that hash, compute the hash on their own, compare the two, and if they're the same, then they know that that message was not altered in transit. And because that key is managed in DNS by an organization, then they know that org signed the mail. So the steps involved in this are longer than what's here, but hopefully this is the useful and important parts. So the first thing that happens is the message is canonicalized to account for typical processing. So like normalizing white space, things like that. And then the method that's used for that becomes the C equals tag in that DKIM signature header. You can specify what specific headers you want to include in the signature as well with the H equals tag. So we saw before that there are certain headers like the received header, the authentication results header, that get inserted by the receiver. They're not part of the message that you send. And in fact, if you do send those headers, they should be overridden, particularly the return path should be overridden or have additional headers appended to the message. You don't want to sign those because we know that those will change as messages get sent. The things that you do want to sign are the things that don't get changed and shouldn't get changed, like the from header, the subject header, the unsubscribe link, the type of content that it is. So once we've determined the headers that we want to sign, then we canonicalize that message, perform a hash on it using a secure hash. That's also the SHA-1 or SHA-256, not super important, ends up getting encoded in the header. And then that's signed with your private key as part of this public key encryption system. And the public side of that key is stored in a text record under a subdomain of the domain with a part that's known as the selector. So when you sign it, you don't just sign it for sparkpost.com, you sign it and you specify, hey, I'm using the selector key 0920. And so in the header, it says, hey, the signing domain is sparkpost.com, and the selector is key 0920, and then I look up the underscore domain keys selector domain text record. I get back the public key, and then so it's signed with that private version. The signed hash is put in the message, and then the recipient is able to reproduce all of those steps, decrypt the hash, and compare it against its own. And if they match, then they know for sure that the person that purported to send the message actually sent the message. I know that's a little complicated. So like we had SPF best practices, let's talk about some DKIM best practices as well. We talked about the first one already. Don't sign headers that are likely to be altered. A decent set is the one that I've listed here. If you actually look in the specs, there's a slightly longer list of things, but they're really the things that aren't going to get changed in transit. The signing entity is the entity that keys the reputation at most providers, right? So if I'm sending an email message and I sign it with mailstream1.sparkpost.com, that becomes the reputation entity, or an important reputation entity at many providers. So just as you might put different streams under different sending domains, right? If I want to segment my marketing mail under one stream and my like my order confirmations under another stream, and have them have different sending domains for reputation, I also want them to have different signing domains so that reputational divide is maintained. Also recommend that you tag your selector. I like to tag it with the date that it was created, or some version of that. So like when I was saying key 0920 before, that's because it's September 2020. Excuse me. So that makes it easy to rotate keys, and you should rotate keys on a regular basis. Anyone who follows public key cryptography knows that it's an evolving space, and you shouldn't rely on your keys remaining secure for forever. So it's a good idea to rotate your keys. And if you version your selectors in a nice way, then you can start signing with a new key, deprecate the old one, and then get rid of the record when you're confident that no one will need to verify the signature again. Great. And then for some DKIM references, honestly, if you're using a cloud provider to send, they'll almost certainly have a built-in DKIM builder because they'll want to generate that key pair themselves so that they can store the private key. And then what you'll be responsible for is creating the text record of the public key, so that DKIM builder will support that. If you're running your own on-premises MTA, you can use a tool. We also have a free tool for generating DKIM keys to create your key pair, or if you're more technical, you can just use OpenSSL directly. In either case, like SPF, because these records hinge on having an associated DNS record, you'll need to get assistance from someone who manages DNS for your domain. Awesome. With that, I'm going to pass back to Alwyn to walk you through how DMARC works.
Yeah, thanks, George. Yeah, so why DMARC and why now? I think what George explained as well is like the basic of email authentication, SPF and DKIM, is becoming really mainstream. So eventually abuse is becoming mainstream as well. The originating reason for SPF and DKIM is just protecting your domain against unauthorized senders. And again, authenticating emails, imposing a layer of trust to a piece of email. Yeah, again, domains identify brands or organizations, similar to the logo you have as an organization. So domains are part of your online identity. So you need to protect your online presence as an organization. Again, email is an open standard. That's what we've been trying to explain as well. Like it's really open in a way, so it's prone to abuse. And again, currently with now everyone participating, DMARC is more broadly available. So the standard originated back in 2012. We're a few years ahead. Everyone is sort of supporting the standard, so it's time to step in. And I think DMARC also allows you to get some more rewards out of it, because well, BIMI is just one of the things that's rewarding marketeers of actually going through the whole DMARC implementation as well. And again, DMARC allows you to gain visibility as an organization of who's sending on behalf of your domain. Again, DMARC is trying to protect the from domain. So DMARC is trying to solve the question, and I tend to tell it more often, like from my dad perspective, he is still wondering, is the email really coming from this particular sender? We need to have technology actually help the recipients and take that question out of their hands and actually move it into a cleaner inbox. So DMARC stands for is just an acronym, domain-based message authentication, reporting and conformance. It's well a mouthful, but in short, it's just an identity check you're attaching to email. It's an identity check guaranteeing well, some trust about your organization. DMARC introduces a policy component instructing how receivers should act on email that's unauthenticated or not authenticated by your organization. And again, protecting your domain is creating brand protection as well, and eventually brand protection is increasing the trust in your brand, and is showing integrity to a lot of well, pieces of email. How does it work? Again, SPF, DKIM, DMARC, and just another DNS technology located at under bar DMARC in your DNS. It's built on top of existing email authentication technologies, and it's doing that because it does not want to interfere with those. Changing existing technologies is difficult, so please leave them alone. Just use the output to put in verdict. There's a feedback component so that you're able to see who's sending email on behalf of your domain, and the policy component actually allows you to start blocking unauthorized email coming from your domain. So that's why I put it into a Lego block. It's built on top of DKIM and SPF. So to summarize again, George explained it before, like SPF is just declaring what servers are allowed to be sent on behalf of a domain. I'm not going to jump into the difference about it all. DMARC is imposing identifier alignment to a piece of email. So DMARC is about protecting the from domain, the domain that my dad sees as an email in his email client, and it's aligning the technical domains of SPF and DKIM with that from domain, introducing a layer of trust. It needs to be either SPF or DKIM, and that the alignment part is in import, because I consider DMARC, the policy component, to be as a belt and suspender technology. SPF the belt, DKIM the suspenders, and the DMARC policy is just your trousers. So if you lose both of them, then the policy is going to affect it, because then your trousers actually drop. DMARC introduces 3 layers of policy. None just for monitoring only. That's the best way to start. And eventually, if you're going through a DMARC uptake implementation, everyone's going to play ball in the DMARC, or sorry, the identified alignment implementation. Then you can start considering moving to a policy of quarantine or reject, depending on your needs. But always start with a policy none first, please. It's a step-by-step approach that is built into the specification. So where to start? Normally you start off with defining your DMARC in the underbar dmarc.domain.com. Please define where you want to collect your data. So there's the reporting component requires where the information is going to be sent. So in this case, and there's example reports at example.org. Go and start with a monitoring only policy called none. So do not apply a policy to piece of email. because then you gain the insight without affecting any of the business. And the most important thing, I like DNS records to be simple, so keep it as short as possible and just remove as much as extras from it to keep it readable and understandable. Sort of a benefits of DMARC. So built from anti-spoofing technology, so it secures your domain or your organizational email domain. The feedback component allows you to gain visibility in who is using your domain to send email to the internet. It also allows you to start implementing SPF and DKIM in an aligned way, so you're able to fix email coming from your domain or legitimately coming from your domain, and eventually it's just building your identity on the internet. It's allowing your organization to be identified through a piece of email. And if you've gone through the whole implementation of DMARC in an organization, there's one thing you get from a technology perspective. There's currently an industry-wide standards effort going on to unify brand logos. It's called BIMI, so brand indicators for message identification, and it's built on top of DMARC. It requires DMARC to be at the level of quarantine or reject, and it introduces the brand logos in the user interface of your email client. So that's, from a marketer perspective, your reward of implementing DMARC. How to get there? So you need to work out a plan with your IT team. The good thing is here, you can actually start by improving visibility, and after placing a DMARC record on your domains, looking at what the data is flowing in, you actually have some plan you can actually go forward with. The bad thing, or the less good news, is that you might discover a lot of parties sending email from your domain, or email authentication, SPF and DKIM might be broken. You might discover things that you actually need to fix, and you need to start improving that and going down that road. And eventually, just some advice on actually going forward. DMARC is all about domains, so gather all your domains in a domain portfolio, find out where you collect the data, publish a DMARC record with Policy.non, and after 3 to 7 days, you can actually start analyzing your data, implementing SPF and DKIM. And well, after that, you're ready to engage with the rest of your organization to actually say, like, hey, let's move forward and start rolling out DMARC in our organization. And there's a link in the slide that I cannot click on, but you can actually find some extra useful guides to protect unused domains against abuse. And that's sort of my story about implementing DMARC in a nutshell. Not sure if there are any questions.
Hi, George and Owen. This is Laura here. Oh, this is Laura here from Spark Post. It looks like we have a couple questions that came in. So the first question is, we're having big trouble sorting out spam email sent to support at address to Freshdesk. Could these authentication options help us solve the problem? The provider seems overwhelmed with a valid spam filtering feature.
Would you like to pick that one up, George, or shall I?
I think I'd like to. I'm not sure I understand the flow of it completely. So this is messages from like oh, Laura, push to the question. Sorting out spam emails.
Yeah, so it's as far as I understand, it's about inbound email to in this case Freshdesk or a help desk support system.
Right.
And
presumably from a bunch of different random recipients. Yeah, I mean I think that the unfortunate part is that that all of these authentication mechanisms are really designed to like be implemented by the sender of messages. And so if the problem is with Freshdesk spam foldering messages from your end users, I'm not sure that it would directly assist with that, outside of maybe encouraging your end users to to implement authentication technologies themselves. I do think it's worth digging a little deeper to understand why those messages are getting classified that way. Is it that you have users sending from all sorts of like random small domains that are self-hosted, which may in fact be sort of like an IP management problem. One of the other problems that I've seen commonly with help desk systems is that because providers like Freshdesk, really need to implement content-based filtering on messages, oftentimes support tickets, because they contain like this raw information presented from users, sometimes contain objectionable information, and then it gets miscategorized. I don't know. I don't use Freshdesk, so I don't know a lot about it personally, but I would encourage you maybe to investigate whether or not they're able to dial down the content filtering on your specific account to make it more lenient for users, posting to you. I don't know, Alwyn, do you have thoughts as well?
Yeah, I think eventually the most important thing is about email authentication. It's all about authenticating the good email. So in an ideal world, if everyone would be authenticating email, then you could use the reverse techniques to sort of leave the bad outside and just take on the good stuff. So the authenticated email. That's sort of a utopia in a way, because email is way too big. But especially if you're expecting email from users that are running within larger organizations or at larger hosting companies, well, I would actually urge them to actually start following the authentication best practices, because that also makes Freshdesk's life easier, filtering out the proper email, or at least leaving through the proper email and just keeping the spam out of the door.
It looks like we have 3 more questions,
Okay.
so we can answer those. So the next question I'll post in the chat here. What are your opinions of ESPs that set up DMARC policies for their sender domains with P equals reject, but don't include email addresses that receive forensic reports?
Ooh, that's a good one. So the DMARC specification has within the specification, there's not enough effort put into the forensic part. So from an implementation perspective, so I'm trying to the forensics are nice to have, but not really very useful. Again, with all the privacy policies in place nowadays as well, do you want to actually receive those forensic reports? Because DMARC also allows you to receive the aggregate ones. I think the most important thing is that from an ESP perspective, it's always wise to receive the aggregate reports, but the forensics, well, personally, I don't care. At least I do not want to touch the privacy part of the whole conversation.
Great answer. I have nothing to add.
Awesome. Somebody asked if we will be sending the presentation, and yes, we will. You will receive the presentation recording as well. And then we have 2 more questions, which I think we just have time for. And it says, what is your stance on DigiCert's VMC certificate? I'll post in the chat as well here for you.
Yeah, so I think that question is tailored towards BIMI. And showing the logo in the mail client in this case, from an email perspective. The BIMI specification introduces another way of authenticating the logo, because from a specification perspective, they want to avoid logo spoofing. So no one actually wants their logo to be abused if authentication is set up badly. There is, to be honest, at this point, there's not that much information around the whole certification process. So but that's my personal opinion. Eventually, a certificate will actually cost you money if you want to, well, protect your logo against spoofing. But that's, to be honest, the only thing I can say about it at the moment.
Yeah, I feel like adoption across the board with BIMI is still very nascent, and I think it's too early to say how it's all gonna actually shake out.
Okay, and it looks like we have about 3 more questions that just came through. So we can, if you gentlemen would like, we can continue to answer those. The next one is how often should we change DKIM?
How often should you rotate DKIM keys? I mean, I think it's a little bit of a religious question. I think rotating them annually is probably sufficient. I don't know if there's that much. So I think rotating them annually, I think having the capability to do it on demand in case, you know, there's reasonable suspicion that your signing key has been compromised. But I think annually, you know, you just set up a system and a process for rotating them automatically.
I agree with George. It's the best thing. I think depending on the email volume you send as an organization, and you have to calculate risk as well. It's important to do it at least once a year. If you're in the internet service provider space and you have email boxes and authenticate your email from that perspective, it's definitely wise to do it at least every few months, because DKIM as a technology is, again, what George mentioned, or prone to replay attacks, or your private key can be compromised because of compromised systems. So I think you have to do a total risk calculation, but the most important thing, automate it.
So it looks like we continually have questions coming in. Gentlemen, would you like to answer those off of the webinar, or do you want to continue as well?
I think we can take a couple more here, and then we can answer the rest offline if that works.
That works. So the next question is what's the role split between ESPs and the client, the customer of ESP, and ensuring these protocols are in place?
It's a great question. That's a great question. I mean, it's definitely a partnership that has to happen, because in general, both parties are responsible for some aspect of it, particularly with SPF and DKIM. You know, so on the SPF side, it's important that the provider keep the frag. Well, so first off, if you're not using a custom return path, right? If you're just using the provider's default return path, then it's entirely the provider's responsibility. But if you are using one, then it's important that they keep their include record up to date. And then, you know, there's the implementation component of it on the customer side. And, you know, it's always important to have good monitoring on those, just as a matter of course, so that, you know, a record isn't accidentally removed or what have you, or frankly accidentally persisted past a provider relationship being terminated. So that's really a partnership. And then similarly, when you're using a service provider, you know, the DKIM record is also a partnership. And there it's one that is pretty unavoidable, because you want to be sending from your own from domain, I think pretty much in all circumstances. And so, you know, you're responsible for publishing a record. They're responsible for hosting the key and doing the signing. It's important to coordinate on the selector. And then there's, you know, issues around doing key rotation in that case, since both parties need to participate in that, unless you have a provider that allows you to you know, delegate the excuse me, delegate the signing domain back to them so that they can manage both parts of it, which I think is somewhat uncommon.
Nothing to add to that.
Okay, next question. Hello there. With respect to DKIM, actually, I'm going to post it and then read it out loud for you. Hello there. With respect to DKIM, what are the recommended intervals for rotating keys? Likewise, with specific regards to key generation, we've typically utilized OpenSSL directly. In this respect, we began rolling 2048-bit keys in order to supplement older keys and to generally apply to newer domains on behalf of our clients. Out of curiosity, should we consider a stronger key, or is 2048-bit enough for 2020?
Yeah, that's a really good question regarding the key size. It depends on. I think just put a little bit of context. So previously the key size was 1024-bit. Especially if you're providing a customer with the DNS text record for DKIM, that's fine. A larger key size is going to roll over into longer text records, which is normally going to cause issues with implementation because customers do not normally understand that there's a limit to the amount of characters in a text record. So from my perspective, it would be nice to take that out of their control and actually make sure that you do via CNAME the DKIM setup for your customers. In a way, you're able to roll out those keys as well. At the moment, I do not see an advantage, but that's from my point of view, to a larger key size. But it's more or less to be prepared to actually start doing that. Performance-wise, I think nowadays with the increase of computing capabilities and processor power, even double the size of a 2048-bit is not really an issue anymore from a performance perspective.
Yeah, I'm not a PKE expert. I believe that there's significant risk of compromise to 1024-bit keys, and so it's probably best to avoid them, I think, in this day and age. I think 2048 are, to my knowledge, still secure. I'm happy to be wrong, and if somebody on the call authoritatively knows that, then happy to update the preso afterwards with different information. I think that as your key sizes get longer as well, there's probably some reasonable concern with the ability of providers to support that on the receive side. So I feel like 2048 is very safe. I don't know that 4096 is in broad deployment, but I would be certainly interested if I was wrong. It's possible I'm radically wrong on that.
Okay, and it looks like we have 2 more questions. The first one is, if I change DKIM, the older emails could have troubles if I re-downloaded in an email client.
So it would only be in an email client that dynamically evaluates the DKIM signature, which is typically doesn't happen. I don't know if Thunderbird does client side DKIM validation, but none of the major providers do. They evaluate it at receive time. I think as a general course of practice, the best thing to do when you rotate keys is to keep the old key in circulation for a certain period of time, but definitely not indefinitely, because that eliminates the value of rotating keys in regards to what I guess all the things that you want to rotate keys for, but like particularly in regards to like replay attacks where someone takes your message and resends it, either literally or with only changes that get canonicalized out.
Great. And last question we have is, some ESPs like MailChimp isn't an exception in a way they handle these protocols. They give very limited rules to the customer, if my understanding is correct.
I'm not sure I caught that. Could you post that question?
Yes, I just posted it and I can reread it again. Some ESPs like MailChimp isn't an exception in the way they handle these protocols. They give very limited role to the customer, if my understanding is correct. So I actually don't think it's a question. I think it's more of a statement. So,
right.
Yeah, the only thing I could imagine in this regard is that, as far as I know, MailChimp only allows customers to use how do you call it, DKIM authentication with their own domain. I think they're not utilizing the SPF domain, so they're always using their own domain in that perspective. From a DMARC perspective, that's not an issue. So if you're authenticating your email with DKIM, that's fine from the DMARC perspective. I think there's much more value in actually authenticating your email through DKIM because of the possibility of forwarding of email. So from my personal opinion, I wouldn't be too bothered with SPF if I had to choose between the two protocols. So
yeah,
DKIM
I
would
think
be sufficient.
I mean, I guess my only maybe I don't know that we disagree on this, but I mean, we encourage all of our customers as a best practice to, you know, if at all possible, send with good alignment between, you know, either strict or relaxed alignment between their SPF, between their envelope information and the message information, which then requires you to have a custom return path, like a branded return path that's a subdomain of whatever, you know, the same domain that the mail from or the message from is a subdomain of. So in that case, they all belong to you, and in that case, you need SPF and DKIM. And I think in today's day and age, like, you're decidedly a laggard if your sending infrastructure does not have an SPF record. Now, if that's something that your service provider maintains, that's great. But you, like, to me, it shouldn't be a case of like just, you know, choose one. You should have both. You may be in the situation where somebody else can be fully responsible for the other part of it. I suspect we don't disagree, Alwyn.
No. It's especially from the DMARC perspective. I think I referenced belt and suspenders. So yeah. if you're able to if you want to keep your trousers on, please use both. But using one of them, I think the more customization, or at least the more freedom you offer your customers, I think the better it is.
Yeah. I think in general it's very hard. Like even if lacking an SPF record doesn't cause you problems, it will severely inhibit your ability to remediate problems when they do occur. You're going to have a really difficult conversation when you reach out to a service provider who's blocking your mail, and you're like, I chose not to. Like, we don't believe in SPF. That's not a story that's gonna end very productively, I think.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That was all the questions we had for today. If you would like to stay updated on Spark Post webinars, please make sure to keep checking our website. And thank you for joining today. And thank you, Alwyn and George. You were wonderful. And everyone have a great day.
Fantastic. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.